Flight crew and the passengers describe him as an unremarkable guy. He's a Caucasian male, he's got on a dark suit, black tie, carrying a briefcase.
At first, it was nothing more than a footnote in the annals of airport oddities. A strange case that was discussed in hushed tones among immigration officials and then dismissed as an urban legend by skeptics. The story of the man from Taured had been told for decades. A traveler who arrived in Tokyo in 1954 carrying documents from a country that did not exist on any map. A man who insisted on the legitimacy of his homeland and was baffled when shown a world atlas where Taured simply wasn't there. For years, it had been the kind of tale that conspiracy theorists, paranormal researchers, and alternate history enthusiasts loved to pick apart, citing it as a possible example of interdimensional travel. And yet, until recently, the prevailing belief was that it was a fabrication, a blending of fact and rumor. That certainty shattered when the first solid proof emerged. Not just that the man had existed, but that the documentation of his origin was real, physical, and utterly unlike anything from our world. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. The discovery did not happen in a bustling international terminal, but in a dimly lit storage facility where confiscated items from decades of customs inspections were being cataloged for transfer to an archive. Among battered suitcases and yellowed stacks of passports, an unassuming leather-bound travel wallet was found sealed in an evidence envelope marked with a date, July 1954. Inside were documents that defied every standard of cartography, bureaucracy, and even linguistics. The passport bore the word Taured in embossed lettering, its emblem an intricate geometric crest that researchers could not match to any heraldic tradition on record. The pages were filled with entry and exit stamps from countries that existed in our world, but the locations and dates were subtly, and in some cases radically, different. France and Spain were there, but the boundaries indicated by tiny colored outlines were not the ones recognized today. And in some stamps, the names of entire nations had unfamiliar spellings or accents, as though translated from a slightly divergent root language. What truly unnerved the team examining the find was not just the accuracy of the materials, but their material composition. The paper had the texture and fiber quality of mid-20th century stock, yet the ink resisted the usual spectral analysis. When scanned under high magnification, it revealed microstructures that hinted at a printing technology far ahead of the 1950s. Fine, fractal-like pigment dispersions invisible to the naked eye, but detectable with modern imaging tools. The passport was accompanied by a set of travel documents, hotel reservations, corporate correspondence, and a stack of currency from multiple countries. Among the banknotes was a set of bills labeled in unfamiliar denominations, each marked with the same Taured crest, each depicting landscapes no one had ever seen. Some appeared to show alpine ranges similar to the Pyrenees, but with additional valleys, lakes, and settlements that could not be matched to any known geography. This physical proof transformed the man from a whispered legend into a confirmed historical anomaly. If the documents were genuine, and after weeks of multidisciplinary testing, every indication pointed toward their authenticity, then the implications were staggering. Historians found themselves facing an impossible question. How could someone carry verifiable entry stamps from real nations and yet originate from one that never existed in our recorded history? Some researchers began to revisit the idea that this traveler was a product of a parallel reality, a version of Earth where political boundaries had evolved differently. The first wave of examination focused on the geography implied by the Taured passport's stamps. The capital city listed as the man's home, Tamanrasset, existed in our reality, but in our world it is a town in southern Algeria. In the Taured documentation, it was noted as the bustling capital of a sovereign nation stretching across territory that, in our maps, belongs partly to Andorra, partly to France, and partly to Spain. The stamps suggested not just a different configuration of borders, but an entirely alternate geopolitical history, one where the fracturing of medieval kingdoms led to the rise of a small but influential alpine state. Linguists pored over the documents and uncovered an even stranger detail. The language used in the passport was not a simple translation of French, Spanish, or Catalan. though it shared root words with all three. Instead, it seemed to be a Creole that had evolved in isolation, suggesting centuries of cultural exchange distinct from anything known here. The grammar was complex but internally consistent, as though drawn from a living tongue, not something invented for deception. Even more unsettling was the discovery of idioms that translated awkwardly into our languages, turns of phrase implying political alliances and cultural customs that made no sense within our historical timeline. As attention intensified, a team of forensic archivists examined the wallet's corporate correspondence. Among the papers was a letterhead from a company bearing the name Cronin Dallmeyer Import-Export, listing offices in Taured City, Lisbon, and Tokyo. Business records referenced trade agreements with countries like Basquania and United Catalonia, entities absent from our maps. The paper quality matched mid-century industrial printing, and the typeface, while reminiscent of period fonts, included subtle glyph variations that were unique, the kind of quirks that develop organically in a parallel design tradition. The reality of this find was unsettling because it was so mundane in its presentation. Nothing about the documents screamed science fiction. Instead, they looked and felt like the practical detritus of everyday travel. This grounded nature made the case more disturbing. If this man truly stepped into our world by accident, the barrier between realities was thinner than anyone had imagined. And if he could arrive unnoticed until questioned at customs, then perhaps such crossings had happened more than once. Perhaps they happened more often than anyone dared to guess. The physical evidence alone would have been enough to reignite public fascination. But what came next pushed the story into territory no one expected. While examining the passport under ultraviolet light, researchers found a watermark embedded into every page, a fine lattice of symbols arranged in concentric rings. At first, these were assumed to be part of the passport's anti-forgery design, but computer analysis revealed the symbols corresponded to coordinates. When plotted, they outlined a world map. Not our world, but a variant of it. Continents had familiar shapes, but were subtly altered. Coastlines stretched further or receded in places, and several landmasses were entirely different. A large island existed west of Australia, absent from our geography. Greenland was smaller. The coordinates marked specific cities, some corresponding to real locations here, others existing only on this alternate map. This raised an even more troubling question. If the passport carried a map of another Earth, did that mean the traveler knew he was crossing into foreign territory? Or was it simply the accepted layout of his own reality? Historians were split. Some argued that the watermark might be an official design element from Taured, a patriotic emblem of the homeland. Others believed it was a deliberate navigational key, proof that someone in that other world was aware of dimensional boundaries. The team's investigation took a dramatic turn when they decided to subject the wallet's leather to isotopic analysis. Leather absorbs isotopes from the environment where the animal lived, leaving behind a chemical fingerprint. To everyone's shock, the isotope ratios in the wallet did not match any terrestrial pattern. They were close, eerily close, to the profile of animals from southern Europe, but with tiny deviations that could not be accounted for by climate, diet, or contamination. It was as if the animal had lived in a subtly different biosphere, one with minute variations in atmospheric composition and soil chemistry. These anomalies triggered a wave of quiet panic within certain scientific circles. If the isotopic profile of the wallet's leather was different, it suggested that the man's entire body would have carried the same chemical signature. That meant he was biologically native to somewhere else. Not just a traveler with unusual paperwork, but a living organism from an entirely different Earth. This was no hoax. It was an intrusion from another reality. The implications rippled outward. Physicists began debating whether our universe might be just one of many, with thin seams through which matter and people could slip under the right circumstances. Some speculated that airports might be accidental convergence points, hubs of energy and probability where realities brush against each other. Others proposed that the man's arrival in 1954 was linked to experimental technologies of the time, unintentional side effects of early high-energy physics research, or military radar systems. The investigators' focus eventually shifted to the currency in the wallet. Among the unfamiliar Taured notes were coins bearing dates in a numbering system that did not match our Gregorian calendar. Cross-referencing the symbols with the passport stamps, cryptographers concluded that Taured counted years from an origin point different from ours, possibly the founding of their nation, possibly a religious or astronomical event unique to that world. The coin's metallurgy was another curiosity. Though composed mainly of copper, silver, and nickel, trace elements were present in unusual ratios, suggesting either a different ore source or a refined process unknown to our metallurgical history. The further the research progressed, the clearer it became that the man from Taured had not been a fraud, a delusional traveler, or a clever smuggler. He had been an emissary, intentional or not, from somewhere else entirely. And while his fate after leaving custody remains outside the scope of these findings, the artifacts he left behind spoke volumes. They suggested a world where history had branched, geography had shifted, and humanity had followed an alternate path. A path close enough to ours to be recognizable, yet far enough to be alien. The real shock, however, came when archivists noticed a small sealed compartment in the travel wallet, accessible only by peeling back the inner lining. Inside was a thin metallic card unlike anything else in the collection. It was no larger than a standard ID, but its surface was covered with a grid of tiny raised dots, like braille compressed into micropatterns. When scanned under a microscope, the dots resolved into an array of symbols matching none of the known Taured script, but bearing structural similarities to digital encoding. It was, in effect, a storage medium, a piece of technology decades ahead of its time. Data recovery specialists worked cautiously to read the card without damaging it. Early results indicated that it contained layered information, possibly a hybrid of text and image, stored in a format that required building a custom interface to interpret. What little they could access initially appeared to be maps, though not in the style of the watermark. These maps depicted something stranger. Three-dimensional renderings of landscapes, as if viewed from multiple altitudes. One image seemed to show a city with concentric canals radiating outward like spokes from a hub, another a mountain range with sharp, unnatural angles as though the peaks had been carved. The revelation that the Taured travelers' possessions were genuine did more than shake historians and scientists. It began to pull apart the long-accepted boundaries between folklore and fact. It was as if a curtain had been lifted, revealing that one of the most contested anomalies of the 20th century had not only been real but vastly more complex than anyone had anticipated. Once the existence of the passport, currency, and metallic card became public knowledge within specialized research groups, the focus shifted from mere verification to a far deeper and unsettling question. If someone could step across the unseen threshold between worlds once, what would prevent it from happening again? The very idea forced a re-evaluation of how we understand space, time, and even identity. Traditionally, borders are human-made, lines on a map agreed upon by political powers. But the Taured case suggested there were boundaries far older, carved not in treaties, but in the very weave of reality. And if those could be crossed unintentionally, then the universe itself was far less stable than the comforting, orderly picture most people held in their minds. Researchers began modeling scenarios in which the laws of physics, as we understand them, were not constants but variables, fluctuating ever so slightly between versions of Earth. This opened the door to speculations that certain regions in our world might overlap with others. Thin spots where two realities press so close together that a person, a building, even an entire object could slip from one into the other without any visible rift or portal. Such a concept had appeared in speculative theories before, but never with physical proof in hand. The Taured documents became the cornerstone of what some physicists began referring to as dimensional permeability, the capacity for matter to exist on one side of reality and then, under rare but natural conditions, move to another. This was not teleportation in the science fiction sense. It was more like drifting across a foggy border without realizing that the air and ground beneath you no longer belonged to the same world you left. In the 1954 case, that drift seemed to have been instant, or at least untraceable in real time, placing the traveler at Tokyo Airport with credentials that matched none of the immigration officers' databases. The human factor added another unsettling layer. In this scenario, the man from Taured wasn't just an accidental interloper. He was, in every sense, a citizen of another Earth. That meant his memories, upbringing, cultural norms, and very sense of self were built on a foundation completely alien to our historical trajectory. If questioned in detail about his life, his answers would almost certainly have revealed divergences. Wars that happened differently. Monarchs who never abdicated. Countries that never fell. Cities that never burned. And perhaps even scientific breakthroughs that had no counterpart here. And this is where the heart of the intrigue lay. The tantalizing possibility that locked within his mind was a living account of a parallel human civilization. The metallic card found hidden within his wallet came to be seen as potentially the key to that civilization's self-image. As decoding efforts continued, the three-dimensional renderings began to display a level of precision that rivaled modern satellite imaging. The concentric canal city revealed under the microscope was not only architecturally possible, but displayed an underlying mathematical symmetry tied to ratios found in natural formations, as though their urban design philosophy had fused engineering with environmental harmonics. This suggested an alternate history where human settlement patterns were not driven solely by industrial growth or conquest, but by a conscious alignment with natural landscapes. That realization sparked debates that extended far beyond physics and history. Anthropologists began to consider what this might mean for cultural evolution in alternate worlds. Could it be that in Taured's reality, humanity had taken a path that avoided some of our most destructive impulses? Or did their differences only appear harmonious in a few preserved artifacts, masking a history just as turbulent as ours? The evidence was too fragmentary to answer these questions definitively, yet it hinted at the unsettling truth that our own history, often considered inevitable in hindsight, might just be one of countless possibilities. The political implications were even more profound. If another Earth existed close enough for a man to cross into ours by accident, what would happen if intentional contact were made? Nations in our world have always guarded their sovereignty fiercely. How would they respond to the sudden awareness of neighbors not across an ocean, but across a dimension? The potential for both cooperation and conflict loomed large in speculative discussions. On one hand, the sharing of knowledge could lead to technological and medical breakthroughs decades ahead of our current capabilities. On the other, even the mere existence of another reality might trigger secrecy, militarization, and a race to control, or weaponize, the points of intersection. While the outside world remained largely unaware of these conversations, within the small circle of experts who had handled the Taured artifacts, there was growing unease. Each new piece of data added to the case also widened the gap between what could be explained and what could only be theorized. One example came from the isotopic profile of the wallet's leather, which was peculiar enough to force chemists into rethinking their methods of material classification. It was not that the results were impossible, but that they indicated a set of environmental conditions so close to ours, yet distinct enough to suggest a slightly altered evolutionary path for life itself. This in turn led biologists to speculate that, had the man's remains been available for study, they might have revealed small but undeniable physiological differences. Differences that could have made him vulnerable to or immune from certain diseases in our world. In considering this, some medical historians began to hypothesize about what such differences might mean if contact became common. Could the exchange of microbes between realities pose the same risks as historic encounters between previously isolated human populations? The first voyages between continents in our own history brought devastating plagues to indigenous peoples who had no immunity. The Taured case hinted at a new frontier for such biological vulnerabilities, one in which two versions of humanity might be more genetically divergent than first appearances suggest. The questions kept multiplying. If dimensional permeability was a real phenomenon, could it happen in reverse? Could someone from our world vanish without a trace, slipping into another Earth where their identity and nationality would be just as impossible to verify? Such an idea suddenly cast new light on the countless disappearances recorded throughout history, from the vanishing crew of the Mary Celeste to individuals who simply stepped out of sight and were never seen again. While skeptics cautioned against leaping to such conclusions without hard evidence, the Taured documents provided at least one indisputable data point. A crossing had occurred. Once is enough to prove possibility. One particularly intriguing angle emerged from the linguistic analysis of the Taured paperwork. The language, though related to Romance tongues, had distinct phonetic and syntactic differences. Scholars began to reconstruct what fragments they could, noting that certain words had meanings more expansive or more nuanced than their counterparts here. This led to speculation about the cognitive effects of such a language on its speakers. Language shapes thought, influencing how people perceive time, relationships, and even morality. If the man from Taured had grown up speaking this variant tongue, his perception of reality might have been subtly but fundamentally different from ours. The maps encoded in the metallic card raised still more perplexing questions. Some showed coastlines that did not exist in our reality, at least not in recorded history. Geologists suggested that these differences could reflect a different sequence of tectonic activity, sea level changes, or even catastrophic events that had altered landscapes in one world, but not the other. One rendering showed a chain of islands in the mid-Atlantic, far larger and more numerous than anything on our maps, suggesting that in Taured's reality, the floor of the ocean had never fully swallowed certain landmasses. Such a difference would have reshaped trade, exploration, and the spread of civilizations in ways we could only begin to imagine. The presence of such data on the card implied something equally significant. In the Taured reality, this kind of high-resolution mapping technology existed at least by the mid-20th century, if not earlier. That alone suggested a divergence in technological development, where precision cartography had advanced faster than in our world, possibly due to different geopolitical needs or scientific priorities. The practical uses of such technology, in navigation, defense, or even resource management, could have given their societies a strategic advantage unknown to us. Some members of the research team began to quietly admit what many had suspected from the start. The man's appearance in 1954 might not have been a mere accident. Even if he seemed confused in his interactions with Tokyo customs officers, it was possible that his journey had been deliberate, but gone awry. If his purpose had been exploration, trade, or reconnaissance, the loss of his technology and documents to our authorities would have been an enormous setback. Yet this theory introduced an even darker possibility, that somewhere, in another version of Earth, a file existed on our world, compiled from his observations before he vanished. The secrecy surrounding the continued analysis of the Taured artifacts was partly born from this fear. If the existence of another reality became common knowledge without proper preparation, there was no telling how various powers might react. The risk of exploitation, of attempting to force open the dimensional seam, loomed over every conversation. The physical proof was there, tantalizing, undeniable, but it was also a Pandoras Box. In a more philosophical sense, the Taured discovery challenged the deepest assumptions humans have about their place in the cosmos. For centuries, our view of the world had expanded outward, first realizing our planet was round, then that it orbited the sun, then that the sun was one star among billions. The multiverse concept had been a distant, abstract idea, intriguing to mathematicians and speculative fiction writers, but far removed from everyday life. The Taured evidence brought it to our doorstep. It was not about galaxies far away or alien species in another arm of the Milky Way. It was about neighbors, human and familiar, separated from us not by light years, but by a membrane of reality so thin that, under the right conditions, a man could walk across it. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. If it could happen once, it could happen again. And if it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. There was no way to predict when or where the seams between realities might align, no way to control who or what might pass through. It was a reminder that, despite all our technological triumphs, the universe still held mysteries beyond the reach of our instruments, mysteries that could step uninvited into our airports, our cities, our lives. The most striking part of the entire revelation was how ordinary the man's belongings were. There was no alien glow, no exotic material that dissolved in the air. Everything he carried could have passed through customs in any country, provided the officers didn't notice the discrepancies. It was the banality of it that was most chilling: a passport, a wallet, a few coins, and yet each was a fragment of a reality that was not ours. a piece of a puzzle that hinted at a picture we could not yet see in full. Among the most debated aspects of the Taured case was the traveler's moment of transition. That elusive instant when he ceased to be in his own world and found himself in ours. Without eyewitnesses to the crossing itself, researchers had to speculate based on the nature of his belongings and their state when discovered. None of the objects showed signs of physical stress or distortion, as might be expected if they had been subjected to high heat, pressure, or electromagnetic interference. The stitching on the wallet was intact, the paper was unwarped, the coins bore no unusual patina. This suggested that the transfer between realities had not involved any violent physical process. Instead, it hinted at a seamless shift, as if the man and everything on him had simply been copied from one place to another with absolute precision. Such a smooth transition contradicted many earlier theories about interdimensional movement, which had imagined portals as turbulent, unstable phenomena. If the Taured man's crossing was indeed effortless, it implied a more subtle mechanism at work, one that could allow a person to walk through a physical location in their own world and, without realizing it, emerge in a different one. This had enormous implications for geography as we understand it. A single street corner or mountain pass could be fixed in both worlds, existing simultaneously yet belonging to two entirely different political, cultural, and historical realities. The traveler's arrival in Tokyo might not have been random at all, but the result of him stepping through such a convergence point elsewhere, only to arrive at the airport as if nothing had changed. The possibility that fixed locations could overlap across realities sparked quiet but intense interest among cartographers and geospatial analysts. If such locations could be identified, they might be mapped and studied for patterns. Were they connected to geological features, magnetic anomalies, or even ancient structures? Some suggested that certain sites of historical mystery, places where unexplained vanishings, strange compass readings, or time discrepancies had been recorded, might be other examples of these overlap zones. If so, the Taured case could be the first confirmed example of a phenomenon humans had been encountering unknowingly for centuries. One particularly puzzling feature of the Taured documents was their lack of any visible security flaws. In our reality, mid-20th century passports carried a range of vulnerabilities: ink that bled when damp, photos that could be lifted and replaced, seals that could be faked. The Taured passport had none of these weaknesses. Its materials, while period appropriate, were manufactured with a consistency and precision unusual for the era. This raised the possibility that, in Taured's reality, forgery and counterfeiting had been eliminated earlier in history through more advanced production standards. Such an achievement would have altered everything from trade to international law in their world, potentially fostering a greater degree of global trust, or conversely, creating stricter controls over who could travel. Another striking anomaly emerged during the linguistic reconstruction process. Embedded within the Creole-like language of Taured were recurring references to measurement systems that did not match either metric or imperial standards. The units were internally consistent, but their conversions to our familiar measurements produced irregular numbers, suggesting they were based on a different base system altogether. This might seem trivial, but in practical terms it implied that Taured's engineers, scientists, and navigators operated under entirely different standards of calibration. If such standards influenced their construction techniques or technological design, it could explain the unique proportions seen in the 3D rendered structures from the metallic card. The currency offered its own silent testimony to the differences between worlds. Detailed metallurgical scans revealed that the coins bore minute tool marks, not random scratches from use, but patterned ridges, suggesting they had been struck by dies with a manufacturing method slightly more refined than ours in the 1950s. This indicated that either Taured had advanced minting technologies earlier, or that their economy had developed differently, placing greater emphasis on durability and uniformity in currency. Economists speculated that such precision in money production might reflect a society less tolerant of inflationary shifts or counterfeiting, one that perhaps operated on longer cycles of economic stability than ours. The metallic card's encoded maps also displayed a haunting pattern when examined over time. While most depicted static geography, a small subset showed variations in coastlines, river courses, and urban layouts. This led some to suspect they were not simple maps, but part of a temporal sequence, snapshots of the same locations across different years. If so, the card might have been a portable archive, enabling its owner to view how specific regions had changed over time. The implications were staggering. Not only did Taured possess advanced cartographic imaging, but they may also have prioritized recording environmental and urban change decades before such longitudinal mapping became common here. Beyond the scientific and technical marvels, the human dimension of the Taured event was perhaps the most haunting. Here was an individual who, by all accounts, believed himself to be in familiar territory until the world around him told him otherwise. The psychological weight of that realization, to find every assumption about one's nation, geography, and history contradicted by undeniable evidence, is almost unimaginable. If he had been able to remain among us, the disorientation might have deepened over time as he encountered more and more divergences from the world he knew. This raised questions for psychologists studying the resilience of human identity. How does a person reconcile such an existential shock? Would the mind adapt, accepting the new reality, or cling stubbornly to the truth of its origin? In the Taured case, we have only the silent testimony of his possessions, but those artifacts suggest a man deeply rooted in the legitimacy of his homeland, enough to carry its emblem, language, and currency with unquestioning confidence into what must have seemed like a routine business trip. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on the man from Taured being real and shocking new findings? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.